This is Modern Political Philosophy for Monday, March 14th. We're continuing our discussion of the Discourse on Method, and what I'd like to do today is to actually walk through the nature of the scientific method, both as Descartes lays it out essentially in part 2, but as you're going to see, the nature of the method requires you to string together several elements of the book, as both in terms of the rules of the method as laid out, but then also in terms of other parts of the book, I think that provide a more complete notion of what the scientific method is. Then we'll walk through book 3, or part 3, I should say, the moral rules that Descartes derives from or hover around the life of science and the scientific method. And then we'll turn to part 4. And I think the three most important things, 4 perhaps, and we'll start with the first one in just a second, is the nature of truth, and the refoundation of the new human science and human condition based on the one undoubtable statement that human beings can make, bearing in mind that Descartes has revealed that the great problem with almost all human knowledge, so-called knowledge, philosophy, science, etc., religion up till this point, all politics and all culture, is that people assert things to be true that are in fact doubtable. So if you clear away, as he claims to have done in parts 1 and 2, all the existing detritus, the trash of inherited and regnant mistaken ideas, what is in fact the foundation of the new planned city that he begins with in part 2, the beauty of a planned city designed by a single mind and a single effort. And you'll see, by the way, that he's the captain of that effort himself, as he suggests. Not just a single lonely mind sitting in a dark little room illuminated by a little stove, thinking through his own problems, but literally the captain of a new movement within the human race, as he reveals himself to be in part 6. After seeing what truth is, and let me just say what that is, and we'll see the quote in a minute. What is true? What is truth? It's whatever is clear and distinct in the mind. Clarity and distinctiveness is Descartes' standard of what is true. We'll come back to that in a minute. Second, what's the new foundation? What's the beginning of the new foundation that cannot be doubted? Of course, the most famous statement from the book, I think, therefore I am, and we'll examine that. But then also in part 4, he derives 2 other things, the existence of God and the immortality of the soul, from that undoubtable foundation of awareness of one's own existence. And then we'll look at part 5, which is his new physics and anatomy. So what I'm going to suggest is that part 5 replaces, not just comes after, but replaces part 5. God and the soul are replaced with physical nature, matter, the material universe, and the soul is replaced by the body, which leads to the great question at the end of part 5. Is the human soul a product of, or is it separable from and free from the human body? Or does the body cause the soul? Now, as I said in our previous discussion, there's a good deal of debate about how to interpret Descartes on this, and some people consider that Descartes is a monolist, and some a dualist, that Descartes divides the mind completely from the body and therefore finds within the mind a certain kind of principle of freedom from natural physical causality. So you'll see there are different ways to interpret Descartes, and Descartes himself is difficult to fathom on this. And then we'll look at part 6, which is actually the vision unfolding. And last, we'll ask some questions about this Cartesian enterprise that we find ourselves in the 400th year of. Since we're almost at the 400th anniversary of the Discourse on Method in 15 years, I guess, come to think of it, yeah. So anyway, this is from page 20, at the bottom of page 20, and even though he makes this statement in other places, this is the clearest expression of it. So he's raising the question, and we'll see this is related to the construction of the method. How do we know that what we see when we're so-called awake is more real than what we're dreaming? Couldn't this all just be a dream? And here's what he has to say. For how does one know, this is on the bottom of page 20, for how does one know that the thoughts that come to us in dreams are more false than others, given that they are no less vivid or express? Let the best minds study this as much as they please. I do not believe they can give any reason that would suffice to remove this doubt, were it not to presuppose the existence of God. Now, as you're going to see, he will make a claim that his proof of God's existence is necessary for his science to proceed. We'll see about that. But here's where he comes the closest to finding what truth is, and probably the clearest place in the book where he did. For first of all, even what I've already taken for a rule, namely that of all the things that we see very clearly and distinctly conceive, and very distinctly conceive, are true. Now, of course, he goes on to say, only because God exists or is a perfect being, and all that comes from him. So, but there you have Descartes' definition of truth, clarity and distinct. So a true proposition in the mind is one in which all the elements of that proposition are clear and distinct from each other. Clear, evident to the mind, visible, and distinct, separate, or defined from each other. So, so let's find out what scientific method is, both in terms of its overall character, which I'll try to get a sense of what its true essence is, and then how he spells it out in the actual steps of the method in parts 2, and as you'll see in selected passages from part 6. To get a sense of, I'm going to argue that what the scientific method is, and what Descartes' new truth is a combination of an aspect of the old science that he preserves, mathematics, as you'll see in a minute, and a new foundation upon sensory data, and that combining them together in a certain way will correct the deficiencies of both the way that we have lived and the way we sense and move in our world, and the kind of study, the only part of the study of all the 11 sciences that he found valuable, which is in mathematics. This is on the bottom of page 9 and the top of page 10. In my younger days, I studied along with the other parts of philosophy, a bit of logic, and in mathematics, some geometrical analysis and algebra. 3 arts or sciences that seem designed to contribute something to my plan. But, and here are the defects of those parts that he will salvage, nevertheless. But in examining them, I saw that, in the case of logic, its syllogisms and the greater part of its other lessons served more to explain to someone what one knows, or even likely the art of lully, to speak without judgment concerning matters about which one is ignorant, than to learn them. So there's like a syllogism from logic. The most famous example is a syllogism is an argument constructed from a major premise, then a minor premise, and then the conclusion. So the most famous example is all men are mortal. That's the major premise. A. B. Socrates is a man. That's the minor premise. C. Socrates is mortal. But to sort of follow Descartes here, you can turn it around and come to just as absurd a conclusion. All men are mortal. A. B. Socrates is a man. Minor premise. C. All men are Socrates. So there is a certain sense in which a syllogism or a formal argument, logic, is about the substantive clarity of the propositions in one's mind, not necessarily about their objective or external truth. So continuing on the bottom of 9 and 10. And although it contained, in effect, very true and good precepts, bearing in mind that the standard of truth, as we've seen from part 4, is clarity and distinctness, the propositions in your mind must be clear and distinct. Nevertheless, there were so many others mixed up with them that they are either harmful or superfluous, and that it is almost as hard to separate the latter from the former as to draw a Diana or a Minerva from a block of marble that is not yet blocked out. Now, as to the analysis of the ancients and the algebra of the moderns, apart from the fact that they apply only to very abstract, that is to say, non-concrete or sensory or real matters, and to seem to have no practical utility, The former is always so subject to the consideration of figures that it cannot exercise the understanding without exhausting the imagination. And in the case of algebra, one is so governed by certain laws and symbols that out of it one has been made a confused and obscure art that encumbers the mind instead of a science that cultivates it. I assume you've all suffered from high school algebra and geometry, so you must know what he's talking about. That is why I believed it necessary to search for another method that, while embracing the advantages of the three prior existing mathematical sciences, and what is their primary advantage? We'll summarize that in a minute. Um, um, was free from their defects. And since the multiplicity of laws often provides excuses for vices, so that a state is much better when having but a few laws, its laws are strictly observed, so in the place of a large number of rules of which logic is composed, I believe that the following 4 rules would be sufficient be sufficient, provided I may affirm in constant resolution, not even once to fail to observe them. So let's review the 4 laws of the method. And again, I'm going to suggest that there's a 5th component, which is experiment, which is more laid out in part 6. First was never to accept anything as true that I did not know evidently to be so. That is, to avoid precipitous judgment and prejudice, and to include more in my judgments than what presented me itself with such clarity and distinctness. That's the reference to the quote later on in part 4 as to the nature of truth. That I would have no occasion. So first, start with what's in front of you and exclude anything that is irrelevant to what you're observing. So you have to see it with your own eyes. Let's say that's generic empiricism, but it's not enough yet. The second, to divide each of the difficulties I was examining into as many parts as possible and to required to solve them for. So take what you see, analyze it into intelligible components. Third, to conduct my thoughts in an orderly fashion, commencing with the simplest and easiest to know objects, to rise gradually, as by degrees, to the knowledge of the most composite things, and even supposing an order among things that do not naturally precede one another. And you could say what that is defining your terms, what is sometimes called in scientific method operationalizing your terms of analysis. That is to say, one term per one observable thing. This is actually part of modern science that's often referred to as reductionism. So when you take a complex thing like a human being, you can't study a human being as you see human beings. You must divide them to their simplest parts, which is ultimately molecular and atomic reality. Not that he knew about molecules and atoms at that point, but as you're going to see, that's where modern science leads. So there is a certain sense in which you could say, given this reductionism of the third rule, to break things down into only their simplest parts so that you can see the core material causes at work. Descartes would say that to be a psychologist, you have to be a biologist. But to be a biologist, you have to be a chemist. But to be a chemist, you have to be a physicist. All things, as you're going to see in part 5, come back to observable matter in motion. And fourth, the last, to make an enumeration so complete in reviews too general that I would be sure of having omitted nothing. So in other words, observe what you see, uh, um, um, to divide the difficulties into as many parts as possible, to reduce things to their simplest component and explanation, and to check your work, to review things. Now, as you're going to see, that is the core, but probably what you're all thinking, all of you who have been trained in the scientific method, since you had science, so to speak, in the same way that people used to have religious studies or catechism from or religious school from infancy on. Descartes imagines a world in which people are taught science from grade school on. And you've all had 5th grade science, you've all had high school biology and chemistry, you've all had and will have in college some version of science. So on one level, we would say, well, what about experiment? And Descartes is quite aware of the nature and relevance of experiment. And in some ways, you could say this is the 5th part of the method, testing by experiment. And we'll see that experiments have a critical role in this new science, both in terms of how the scientist so-called knows what he claims to know, or she claims what she claims to know, and how the human race itself becomes a unified scientific species. With the overall nature of the method, if you're looking at the notes for today, so you have to combine the advantages of one thing with and the advantages of another thing and combine them and synthesize in such a way. So what is that new thing? How is this? So the problem with mathematics, as we saw, was on the pages we just read from part 2, what you call abstract clarity, or perhaps abstract absurdity, is so abstract and unconnected with real things that although they have a formal distinctness and clarity, they don't have a usefulness or concreteness. Now, as you're going to see, then that will correct the advantage and the problem of the senses. Um, Senses ultimately are what we see and experience in the world through our physical senses. And Descartes will say in part 4 that things that don't have their origin in physical reality, which, as you're going to see, complicates the existence of God, the proof of God's existence, that first we have senses, but then, as you're going to see, there is a problem with the senses, which we've already somewhat alluded to in the passage I read from page 20. And if you go back and look at pages 18 through 20, what's the problem with the senses? They're concrete, they're real, and they are the objects of our passions. The things that move us as animals are the things that we can detect as animals through our senses. But the problem is, as we've already seen from the passage on page 20, as Descartes says, the senses are often deceived because what we sense in the world, and you can trick a cat into making things, a cat or a dog, and you can fool a dog or a child into thinking that what they see is real when in fact it's an illusion. So the problem with the senses is that they're concrete and real, and they guide our passions in what's really what we need. But the problem is they're obscure. Uh, and as he says, we never know if we're dreaming or awake. So the senses have a kind of a concrete reality to them, but they are deceivable. And we often get our minds mucked up in the way we remember, and our passions and our imagination often directs or misdirects our sensory understanding. So, as what I'm going to argue is the scientific method, the new science of Descartes, actually combines the conceptual clarity of mathematics with the concrete uh, nature of the senses and the passions. So, in some ways, what you get, and I'll read from my own notes, the core of Descartes' scientific method, this is on the top of the first page under Roman numeral 1, is a new way of seeing and speaking, a critique of normal language and consciousness as sloppy and imprecise, and ultimately the sources of all the infelicities of the human condition up till now: superstition, religion, division, and war. So on one level, it's we live in a, like Madonna reminds us, I'm a physical girl and I live in a material world. Um, we do, and the problem is just the normal operation of our senses get all screwed up. If only we could take the clarity and formal distinctness of ancient mathematics and impose it on sensory experience, we could have a new way of looking at the world. We could free ourselves from all the nonsense, and ultimately, in the next sentence, humanity has been nature's its own victim because its internal state of consciousness has never been able to see the world and its forces clearly and distinctly, so that we could never agree nor even exert genuine control over our circumstances. For example, warmth is how we normally experience heat in the world. But that's not how a scientist experiences heat. He experiences temperature in terms of measurable units. So you could say it's the same phenomena you and I experience when we walk into a hot room, but a scientist can actually define, specify each thing that he's observing, watch it unfold, and trace its causality. And it's that clarity and distinctness that he imposes on empirical or sensory reality that constitutes scientific truth. So the actual steps of the method, as we just on Lord of the Four in part 2, but also let's see how it's also completed by experiment, which is really in some ways the key to the whole thing in part 6. So in part 6, you'll see that experiment becomes the key to Cartesian science. Start with some passages on page 34 towards the top. Just beginning from page 33, better remedy against these two impediments, thus to convey faithfully to the public what little I had found, and to urge good minds to try to advance beyond this, by contributing, each according to his inclination and ability, to the experiments one must have, and also by conveying to the public everything they learn, so that later inquirers, beginning where their predecessors have left off, and thus, In joining together the lives and works of many, we might all together advance much further than a single individual could on his own. Now, of course, uh, the reality of mortality and death has been hovering over the discourse on method. And even though he supposedly proves God's existence and the survival of the individual soul past death, we'll come back to that in a minute, you'd have to say that uh, he is aware of the fact that we all die and that he dies and that all he can do is start the thing. And nature, as you're going to see, is so complex and vast that unlocking it scientifically can't be the work of one mind. There might be individual minds that make great discoveries, like a Galileo or a Newton or an Einstein. But ultimately, science has to be the collective activity of the entire race, which means, of course, you've got to overcome the existing divisions in the human race: political, cultural, religious, etc. But to continue, and we'll summarize about the role of experiment and method. So, um, to continue on the next page on 35, the end of the first paragraph on the page, I urge all those who desire the general well-being of men, that is, all those who really are virtuous and not through false pretenses or merely through reputation, to communicate those experiments they have already done, as well as to help me in the search for those that remain to be done. And on page 38 and 39, um, um, down towards the that large full paragraph on page 38. I am convinced that had someone taught me from my youth all the truths which I have sought demonstrations, and had I no difficulty in learning them, I might perhaps have never learned any other truths, or at least I would never have acquired the habit and faculty I think I have for finding new truths, to the extent that I apply myself in searching for them. And, in a word, if there is in the world any task that cannot be finished by anyone but the person who began it, it is that on which I am now working, which, of course, is launching the enterprise of science. And then on the next page, it is true with respect at the bottom of 38 and the top of 39. It is true that with respect to the experiments that can help here, one man alone cannot suffice to do them all, but he cannot as profitably use hands other than his own, unless they be those of craftsmen or such people as he can pay and for whom the hope of gain, which is a very effective means, would make do precisely when he ordered them to do so. For, as to volunteers who, out of curiosity or a desire to learn, offer themselves in order perhaps to help him, aside from usually being high on promises and low on performance, and from having grand ideas, none of which will come to anything, they inevitably want to be paid by explanation of various difficulties, or at least by compliments or by useless conversations which could not cost him so little of his time that he would not be lost to him. Um, and as to the experiments that others have already done, even when these people desire to communicate them to him, um, what those who regard him in their secrets never do, they are for the most part composed of so many detailed and superfluities that it has been hard to discern the truth in them. Besides, one finds that almost all of them to be badly explained or either false. So much of the work of science remains to be done. Um, and on page 40, um, that is seeing more and more every day the delay that my plan of self-instruction is suffering because of the infinity of experiments I need to make, and that it is impossible to carry out with the help of somebody else. Although I do not flatter myself into hoping that the public will become greatly involved in my affairs, and I do not wish so much to fail myself as to give cause to those who survive me reproach some day for having been able to leave many things that were much better had I not overly neglected to make them understand how they could contribute to my plans. So, um, so experiment is central in terms of the discovery of the kinds of truths that the first four steps would make clear. And you'd have to say in this whole vision, experiment, and in the middle of the page on my notes is where I summarize them, you'd have to say it's twofold. It's the provisional bridge between internal and external consciousness. That is to say, remember, Descartes says, with the exception of the clarity and distinctness of our thoughts, we never know if we're dreaming or awake. I think he's serious about that. That is to say, we can never know if the thoughts we have on the inside, with the one exception of the absolute certainty of our own existence, we can never know if anything that we say about the outside world is true or not. So scientific truth, it turns out, is remarkably provisional, and the expectation is that it's like the reverse, the asymptote of a hyperbolic curve. A curve that approaches a limit but never reaches it. So the scientist can never really claim that what he or she is seeing is the truth. Experiment is the closest thing that can make sure that what you're claiming about external reality at least resembles it, because you actually act out what you're conceiving to be the mechanism involved. So, but that means scientific truth is never finally attainable, although there might be an endpoint, and we'll see what that endpoint is. That is to say, how will we know when the scientific enterprise has reached its goal? And I'll reflect on that later. Um, Part of it depends upon what the promise of the scientific method is, which we've already seen, which is to make us master and possessors of nature. Um, so, so not only does experiment come the closest to which an individual scientist can know whether or not what he thinks is happening on the outside in the objective, so-called objective, but again, I want you to make sure. I think Descartes is real about this. The so-called objective world is always unattainable. It isn't knowable. It's only a propositional approximation of the truth. An experiment is the closest thing we have to matching internal reality to external reality. But the second role, which what these passages in part 6 convey, is this is the connection between the individual scientist and the public community of scientists. So philosophy no longer aims, like through the Socratic method in the Republic, of the dialectical grasp of reality in the full mind of the philosopher, which ultimately cannot be communicable to other human beings because they're non-philosophers. Descartes intends scientific truth to be, in fact, it requires communicability and replicability. Um, so science is a body of analytic knowledge that is grounded upon an ever-expanding base of experiments, and and moreover, this is absolutely necessary because, as Descartes reveals to you in part 6, he's just a single person, and nature is so complex. For us to become masters and possessors of natures, it really must be us. I can't do it, but if all of humanity can set aside its divisions, it's religious, it's political, it's so there is a political dimension to this. Although, as you're going to see, it's really Hobbes who makes the political implications of universal science much more attainable. More about that in the Leviathan coming up. Um, but nevertheless, science must become the activity of the human race because of the mortality of the individual scientist and because of the complexity of nature. And the way you do that is by dividing nature in its vast complexity up into all kinds of sciences, which is why you need etymology, entomology, the science of insects, and proctology, the science of political, of what my department chair is an expert in. So in the same way that the scientist breaks down problems into identifiable and measurable steps, nature has to be broken up into measurable and knowledgeable small pieces, and then assembled in the activity of the species as a whole. That's the core of the method, both in terms of what it is, as in terms of mathematized sensation. That's my coined term for combining the advantages of the old mathematically, its clarity and distinctness, with sensation, and with its concreteness and its reality. But curing the defects. The sensory part and the empirical part cures the abstractness of the old math. The formality of the old math cures the obscurity and dupability of the sciences in concrete experience. Mathematized sensation. So what about the moral rules? What's the reason in part 3 then for introducing moral rules? Why would a scientist trying to teach other people about science require a moral context? And so here are the four uh, 3.5. It's almost interesting how laying out the precise clarity and distinctness of the moral rules, it's either 3 or 4. 1, obey the laws and religion of my country, or else you'll get in trouble. But also, perhaps you need some kind of guidance while you're tearing down the old house. And you're going to see that's the metaphor for the whole thing. How do you tear down and reconstruct the house you're living in at the same time that you're building up the new one? Now, I would argue that what you've seen in the last 400 years is exactly what Descartes plans. You move from a world in which politics and religion dominate, you introduce science, it gets spread, and eventually the hope is that scientific knowledge will